Upon them, something has to explain the novelties themselves.
Yeah. Well, the novelties themselves, of course, are genetic variations in the gene pool, which ultimately come from mutation and more proximally come from sexual recombination. There's nothing very inventive or ingenious about those novelties. I mean, they are random. And they mostly are deleterious. Most mutations are bad. And so you really need to focus on natural selection as the positive side, and it's only natural selection that produces living things which have the illusion of design. The illusion of design does not come from the novelty.
What was it about that early novelty, before it culminated in something as useful as a feather? Where could natural selection get its purchase upon something which was no more than a pimple?
There cannot have been intermediate stages which were not beneficial. There's no room in natural selection for the sort of foresight argument that says, well, if we got to persist for the next million years and it'll start becoming useful. That doesn't work. There's got to be a selection pressure all the way.
So there isn't a process, as it were, going on in the cells saying, look, be patient.
No.
It's going to be a feather, believe me.
Yes. It doesn't happen like that. There's got to be a series of advantages all the way in the feather. If you can't think of one, then that's your problem, not natural selection's problem. Natural selection, well, I suppose that is a sort of matter of faith on my part, since the theory is so coherent and so powerful.
Richard Dawkins' faith in natural selection is bolstered by the fact that, as Darwin noticed, the painful details hardly support the idea of a benevolent designer.
I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that God would have designedly created that a cat should play with mice.
Darwin's own religious faith had slowly ebbed away over the years, but that was due as much to the death of his daughter as to his scientific ideas. But for a variety of reasons, not least of which was the fact that his wife was still deeply religious, and he himself, of course, realized the theological implications of his own theory, Darwin resisted publication of his work for almost 20 years. It was only when another, younger man, Alfred Russel Wallace, submitted a work with almost exactly the same scientific conclusions that Darwin was pushed into publication, and as he feared, the reaction was dramatic.
Is it on his grandmother's or his grandfather's side that he claims descent from a monkey? There is a metaphysical part of nature. A man who denies this may sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since written records began.
For understandable reasons, the established church was appalled by the theory of evolution because it denied the very idea of an inaugural creation in which all natural forms had been established from the outset. And as far as the clergy were concerned, what was even more shocking was the idea that man was included in this process, and that as a mere descendant of apes, he had lost his curious spiritual priority. Man was no longer the star of this cosmic event.
When you consider the relative ease with which educated Christians, as we've already seen, had been able to reconcile their beliefs with some of the new astronomical discoveries, it's not altogether surprising that, with the exception of ignorant and stupid fundamentalists for whom Darwinism is a blasphemy, there were, and still are, religious people willing and able to accommodate the now undeniable Darwinian proposals. But the point is that the religious now had to visualize the architecture of living things in an altogether new way, one in which God could no longer be represented as an ever-present, pedantic designer. But while the religious view of God was growing more attenuated, those who took a skeptical and radical view were feeling more and more confident. The leadership of the skeptical and radical reformers was now undertaken by George Jacob Holyoake, and in his journal, The Reasoner, he coined a new word to describe a belief system based upon reason and science. He called it secularism. Well, by the middle of the 19th century, there were more than 40 secular societies in Britain, and Holyoake's journal was selling more than 5,000 copies a week. Secularism was hugely popular throughout the 19th century, and the National Secular Society still exists in the 21st century here in Conway Hall in London. After Holyoake, the leadership of the secular societies fell to Charles Bradlaugh, a radical MP famous for being expelled from Parliament and briefly locked in the Tower of London for his failure as an atheist to swear on the Bible his oath of allegiance. Bradlaugh secured the right, which we still enjoy, for every man and woman in this country to affirm an oath rather than having to swear on the Bible. At the turn of the century, one might have been forgiven for thinking that disbelief would soon triumph, that religion would soon fade away and die. Nietzsche had just said, amongst many other things, that God was dead. So why should faith survive? But by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, there emerges a man who claimed to understand the origins of religion, of all religions. Sigmund Freud. Although Freud was by no means the first thinker to try and explain the psychological origins of religion, his account is perhaps the most systematic attempt to represent faith as something fundamental to early human mental development. Well, Freud, like me, came from a Jewish background, although for obvious reasons he was much more explicitly aware of it than I am. Even so, Freud never really identified himself with the religion itself, and as a student of science, he became increasingly suspicious of religion as a whole. And with the development of what became psychoanalytic theory, he began to recognize that the belief in God, that's to say in some sort of supernatural agency to which human beings were answerable, was the inevitable result of the infant's helplessness and his relationship to the apparently all-powerful figure of the father. Look, this is what he says about it in his book called The Future of an Illusion.
The rest of our inquiry is made easier because this God-creator is openly called Father. The psychoanalysis of individual human beings teaches us that the God of each of them is nothing other than an exalted Father.
So he saw religion as an illusion. Now, although he describes this as a wish fulfillment, it's quite difficult to see it entirely in that light, since the figure created by the infant imagination had punitive as well as benevolent characteristics. But however Freud explained that apparent contradiction, it's quite clear that he saw religion as false and profoundly unhelpful.
Religious teachings are neurotic relics, and the time has probably come for replacing them with the results of the rational operation of the intellect.
For obvious reasons, Freud's theory disconcerted the conventionally religious. But the social implications of his theory were trivial in comparison with the politically programmatic atheism that emerged in the most radical of the ideologies that had been developing over the 100 years since Thomas Paine.